Hey guys, Alan here, Solid Rock Bible Class. Hey, I'm so glad you're with me this morning. Boy, it's a nippy little morning out here this morning. But let's get going here, and we're going to be asking ourselves a question. What happens when we make a request to God and God says no? How do you respond when God says no? How do you respond to it? I want to jump over into 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter. And we're going to be in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter. I'm going to pick it up. I'm just going to read a couple of verses along the way here. But in verse number 6, he says, "But the things displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give me a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed unto the Lord." I think all of us kind of remember the story as we look at it, and we know that if we jump all the way down to verse number 22, God gives him a king. It's against his advice, but he gives it to him anyway. In the 8th chapter, verse 22, it says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, Hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, Go ye every man into his city." So, has God ever just said no to something you really, really wanted? God said no to Israel. Maybe you ask it over a new job, or maybe it was some sort of a career change that you wanted to make. Maybe it was this new house that you wanted to buy, or maybe it was a new car you wanted to buy. But in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, we find this occasion where God's people take and they request something. It was something they did not need. It was something God didn't want to give them. It was something Samuel didn't want to give them. And when they prayed to God, God told them no. The people had taken and came to Samuel, and they wanted to appoint a king to rule over them. And they had a few reasons why they wanted to do that. Samuel took and he sought the Lord, and the Lord said no, and he informed Samuel that the king was not in the best interest of the people. So when we consider the truth of it, we have to ask ourselves two questions. The very first question I think that we need to ask ourselves when God just looks at us and says no is, what is the desires that we really have? What is the desires of what we really need? And then the second question is, what are the reasons God's saying no to us? I think that's really the important piece. Why is God telling us no? Sometimes I think we're kind of like this kid in a candy store or a kid in a toy store. We want it now. So, the question I have for you is, do you take no for an answer, or do you just take and go ahead with it even though God says no? No matter what God's answer is, I'm going to get it, I'm going to throw a fit till I get it. That's what Israel did. So let's see what we can kind of learn here. This is going to be really brief this morning in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter. So, let's see what will guide us through here. The very first question is, what is the spirit that drives us to desire what we do not need? What drives us? What motivates us? In the case of the Israel people, it was this insecurity. We find it in verse number 5. They had 3 reasons why they was requesting a king here. The reasons are all found in verse number 5, and it says, "And said unto him, Behold, thou art old." So there's one. "And thy sons walk not in thy ways." That's number 2. "Now make us a king to judge over us." And look what they said, "like other nations." So Samuel, he was old. He was nearing the end of his life. He was nearing the end of his ministry. And then we see that Samuel's sons, we know, were corrupt. And they didn't really show any really true signs of good leadership. And so the Israelites They didn't want to trust God to take care of them. They was afraid to let God take care of them. They had this insecurity that drove the Israelites to take and to ask very foolishly on two different occasions here for a king. So let's look back at a couple other things where Israel just asked for things they shouldn't have asked for. Let's give a couple of fast examples here, I guess. After coming out of Egypt, they faced a time of fear when they were trapped. If you'll remember right, finally after the plagues, God took and he allowed the people to go. Pharaoh let them go. And they got all the way to the Red Sea, and they were trapped. In that moment of insecurity, they made a very foolish statement. I think all of us probably remember what they said. They said that they would rather live in Egypt in bondage than to take and to die in the desert. Let's look at another example. Just shortly after that, we see them at Mount Sinai. They face this moment of extreme insecurity when Moses takes and he delays coming back from the mountain. Remember, God's giving Moses a lot of instruction. God is giving him the 10 Commandments here. And in that moment, they took and they pressured Aaron to take and build him this golden calf. Why? So they had something to worship. They were used to these gods of Egypt. Insecurity, it'll drive us to make extremely bad choices. So we have to be very careful about that. So Israel and the Israelites, they were influenced greatly by this insecurity. A kind of a closely related point is that they were influenced by people that were also around them. They observed these other nations. And they observed how they were doing it. They had a king that went with them to war. And when they took and they compared themselves to other nations, they found themselves wanting to play and this game of let's play copycat. That childish game of copycat. The second question that we need to really ask ourselves here in regards to this is, when God says no to us, what is the reason God says no? God sometimes says no because he knows some things are going to just harm us. He's looking out for us. God told the Israelite people that a king, it would be extremely unhealthy for them. He took and he explained that a king would take and dictate over them. Just be a dictator. He explains that in verses 11 through 18, and I'm really not going to go in there and read it. And then, when God says no, we have to realize he has a really good reason for it. For instance, there's a lot of discussion in regards to the 10 Commandments in recent years. Many people consider them to be kind of outdated rules. Not so, huh? They consider them to be negative commands. We don't like negative, do we? We want only positive reinforcement. Well, I have to admit, 10 Commandments, there are some negative commands there. What those people do not realize, though, is that when God gives a negative response, he has an extremely positive reason for that. I mean, let's consider, what about the command he gives us of not stealing? God knows that stealing, it's going to ultimately harm us. It's going to ultimately harm people around us. It will harm a person's integrity. It'll put a dark spot on a person's character. And it's really, it'll land you in jail. See, sometimes God says no because he has something better for us. Many years ago, I applied for a particular job. It was at a hospital. Interview actually went pretty well. I will say that the interviewer was a little bit of a jerk, but the interview went well. At the end of the day, end of the story, I didn't get the job. But when I look back at it, I can see that it wasn't a good move. It wasn't in my best interest. There were some bad things that happened around that hospital and that department that I was being interviewed for. And guess what? God had something better. You know, the bottom line in accepting this no answer in our life from God is to learn to be submissive. Isn't that difficult, being submissive to God's will? That's difficult. We must learn to take and submit to His will. Romans, the 12th chapter, verse 2, he tells us to be transformed, to be renewed. This renewing of our minds that we might prove what is good and acceptable and the perfect will of God. We can live in the perfect will of God, or we can live in the submissive will of God. I'd rather live in the perfect will of God. God has a perfect will for us. It's our job to take and to find it. Sometimes that involves God looking at us when we have a request that's not good for us and He says no to us. So, you know, sometimes it's okay at the end of the day that we don't really truly understand why God says no. It's okay when things don't work out and we don't totally understand. But I think if you'll look back at your life like I've looked back at mine, in many ways, God has taken and guided us through this journey. He's guided us through this journey of life, and it's been to our best interest. This is Alan. I'm going to take and say goodbye for now, and we will catch up